As tensions between the U.S. and China continue to mount, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has announced a visit to Beijing next month. The trip comes as China's influence in the Middle East is growing. President Xi Jinping hosted PA President Mahmoud Abbas earlier this month and presented a Chinese plan for Israeli-Palestinian peace. While earlier in the year, China brokered the resumption of diplomatic ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. The visit signals Netanyahu's growing impatience with the Biden administration, which has said the Israeli prime minister would not be invited to the White House in the near future, as Israel's right-wing government pushes forward with its judicial overhaul plans. Ties between China and the U.S. have continued to splinter following Secretary of State Blinken's visit to Beijing, which ended with Biden calling Xi a dictator. Will Israel's China gamble pay off?
So let's get to it. Will the Israel-China gamble pay off? As always, we begin with a quick fire round, 30 seconds each, and to lay out your initial stance, of course, and we pick up the conversation from there. So Carice Witte, please take the lead.
So I do not think that this has to be seen as a gamble. I do not think that it is a result of Netanyahu's frustration with Biden. It looks like Bibi needs to speak to Xi Jinping in response to the Iranian developments that have been the result of China's brokered deal with Saudi Arabia, and he needs to address the Global Security Initiative, which is proposed to be the security architecture for the region.
Bradley Bowman, your thoughts?
You know, Netanyahu can visit any country he wants, but I think there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. The right way would be for him to make clear explicitly and publicly in Beijing that the bond between the U.S. and Israel is unbreakable and unmatched, and that he understands Beijing's military-civil fusion policy. He might also want to convey behind closed doors that he doesn't appreciate Beijing's activities at the UN and its support for Israel's enemies, including the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Last but not least, Dan Perry, your thoughts?
I think it's absurd to think that Biden is quaking in his boots for fear that he won't beat China to hosting Netanyahu. On the other hand, Bibi has every right to visit China, which is a major trading partner of Israel's, a huge player in the world stage, and probably the biggest investor in the Middle East in recent years. The trouble begins when the Prime Minister's office anonymously suggests to journalists that this should be cast in the framework of Israel suggesting to the U.S. that it has alternatives to American support, which it most certainly does not.
Okay, from this point onwards, let's please feel free to interact and engage in a conversation. So Dan, I do want to begin with you. Is Netanyahu's China first move a strategic mistake? Is it turning Israel into a Cold War pawn, so to speak?
I agree with Mr. Bowman that, because, as I said, Netanyahu has every right to go to China and real concerns with China, there's a right way to do it and a wrong way. And instead of hinting that he's going to China instead of the U.S. because Israel's maybe trying to prove how big and powerful it is vis-a-vis Biden, rather, he should address bilateral concerns with China directly, emphasize that the U.S. relationship remains strong, and one does not come at the expense of the other. I agree with Carice as well.
So Carice Witte, getting close to China, is it good or bad for Israel?
It's not about getting close. I just have to reiterate that both Bradley and Dan, the point is how you do it matters, and it has not been handled well. This happens over and over with the Israeli government. It's very frustrating for we the people, because Israel can do smart things in a not such a smart way, and it loses its effect. It's very important to state that he's going, why he's going, what he wants to achieve. He doesn't have to tell state secrets, but give everybody, make it public. What's all the mystery for, and why imply such silliness? It's ridiculous to think that there's any kind of comparison between a visit to Biden and a visit to Xi Jinping. There's no country in the world where a visit compares to visiting the state leader of the United States, given its security and overall significance to Israel.
But it is coming, I believe, from the Prime Minister's office. In other words, This is not some unintentional miscasting of the visit. They are trying to portray to the Israeli public that Netanyahu is so powerful and he has such wherewithal on a world stage that he can choose to replace the U.S. with China. And the idea is ridiculous because, with all due respect to China, it does not yet equal the U.S. in GDP. It has a fraction of American GDP. And unlike the U.S., it has voted against Israel pretty close to 100% of the time on big issues in the U.S.
100%.
So,
and you couldn't be more right. And China knows it. That's the point. China knows is not. First of all, it knows it's not a superpower. And also it knows that it can't compete with the U.S.
I mean, he should also know that the U.S. is currently somewhat antagonistic to China. I mean, the ban on sales of advanced semiconductors from last November, I believe it was, doesn't come out of nowhere. So clearly, Netanyahu, whose government is currently energetically upsetting not just the U.S. Administration, but the American Jews whose support underpins American broader support, now adds this to the list of reasons for the U.S. to wag its finger at Israel. And if you have Israel's interests at heart, you have to just shake your head in disbelief at the rank ham-fistedness of this government.
So let it be. Please, Mr. Bowman.
May I just jump in? Yeah, may I just jump in? If I don't know what the true motives are, but if it's true that the Netanyahu folks are framing this as a slight to the Biden administration, or demonstrating that they have quote unquote alternatives, to the United States, I think that would be incredibly short-sighted and counterproductive, a big mistake. I would just flag a recent poll by the Pew Research Center that demonstrates Americans of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, have an increasingly negative view of China. I mean, 83% of U.S. adults expressed an unfavorable view to China, with 44% very unfavorable, and it was roughly the same between Democrats and Republicans. How's that relevant? It's relevant because, fair or unfair, we tend to view every bilateral relationship now through the lens of that third country's disposition toward China. So this is if that's how this visit would be framed, or is being framed, as someone who's an American who's very pro-Israel, that would be a big mistake.
Well, by the way, the same polls show, or similar polls show, that at least among Democrats, but really among Americans in general, the positive views towards Israel are plummeting as well. So perhaps this is a case of birds of a feather flocking together.
No, this is just a straight-out mistake. I want to say Prime Minister Netanyahu has serious issues that he needs to raise with China, and he would create a great deal of support and respect from Israel and beyond if he would simply be clear about the fact that he's going to express his concerns regarding Iran, as I said. And I want to just elaborate for 1 second on the Global Security Initiative. The proposal for taking the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is to take it to the United Nations, where and this was said in so many words, where the international community can be the deciding factor on what happens. And we all are very well aware, as Dan said, 100% vote by China against Israel. So the Global Security Initiative, on top of all of that, talks about indivisible security, where no country can take any steps that might affect the security of another country, meaning they're looking at the security of the Palestinians and the Israelis equally. However, that goes against all the agreements by the Palestinians, the Americans, and the Israelis that this is a land for peace situation, that the Israelis are not seeking to attack the Palestinians. They're seeking peace, or they're seeking at least quiet, and are willing to give up land for that. And it is not about security, equal security on both sides. As such, it is a big problem to allow China to start a process that deals with this conflict.
Which only, as you says, validates even more the legitimacy of Netanyahu going to China. He really should raise this. It's in Israel's interest to raise this. I don't think anyone on this panel is saying that Bibi shouldn't go to China. The question is how this thing is being messaged, which is, as I said, ham-fisted and very self-defeating.
But speaking of the framing or the messaging here, today Netanyahu was quoted as saying in closed-door meetings recently that the Chinese involvement development in the Middle East is positive since it will force or obligate the U.S. to step up or stay involved in the Middle East. Bottom line, he is suggesting that diplomatic competition between China and the U.S. is benefiting the Middle East. Bradley Bowman.
Yeah, if that quote is accurate, that sounds a little bit like what we seem to be observing from Riyadh, where they're not getting what they want from the United States, so they're going to use flirtations with the Chinese Communist Party to try to shift American behavior. We can discuss U.S.-Saudi relations if we want to, but I'm not sure Israel wants to be playing from the same playbook as Riyadh on this. And again, I think it would be incredibly short-sighted. China cannot and will not anytime soon be able to replace the United States in terms of the importance of its relationship with Israel. That is a fact. And you're playing with fire if you're a leader of Israel and you're going to try to get something accomplished in Washington by flirting with Beijing. That would be a big, big mistake.
For sure. And even if the quote is accurate, I doubt very much that it is honest, because the last thing Netanyahu wants or needs right now is for the U.S. to step up with its own peace plan, which would cause his ultra-right government to collapse in a split second.
Yeah, well, I think what they're referring to is the fact that there's a perception that the U.S. is overall leaving the Middle East and China's filling that vacuum. And in fact, what is happening is that the U.S. is reshaping its positioning here. There are still more troops, American troops, than any other country by far, certainly China. And the U.S. will probably start to behave as an offshore balancer in that on that front, and then become involved more in diplomatic and economic ways.
Look, and for sure Netanyahu would welcome U.S. involvement on the Saudi front, but I have to think he knows that that would quickly become pressure to make progress on the Palestinian front as well. So realistically, Netanyahu's current government cannot engage with a genuine and positive peace process.
Yeah, Bradley Bowman, briefly before we take a break, bottom line, if there was either an ulterior motive or an explicit motive to get the invitation from Washington closer, sooner rather than later, was that goal achieved with this China visit?
I think the timing is less important than the tone and objectives and what is said while he's there. He has a right as a leader of a sovereign country to go. How he does it matters, and everyone, especially in Washington, will be watching, and there'll be long-term consequences if he messes it up.
Yeah, it's not, it's rarely the what, but it's always the how. Carice Witte, Bradley Bowman, Dan Perry, you're staying with us. We're taking a short break, but when we get back, we continue to discuss the perhaps inevitable confrontation between the U.S. And China and how it affects the diplomatic charm offensive, if you will. A few minutes, and we're back. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Carice Witte, Bradley Bowman, and Dan Perry. Thank you all very much for staying with us. We're also, of course, staying on topic. But before we get back to the conversation, remember that alleged, at least, a slip of the tongue. The American president says, well, no biggie. This authoritarian ruler remark. This is what I'm referring to. Let's take a listen to the American president.
The Secretary Blinken had a great trip to China. I expect to be meeting with President Xi sometime in the future, in the near term, and I don't think it's had any real consequence. And what was your second question?
Yeah, so Biden downplaying the significance of this remark, but will his slip of the tongue be Xi's potential casus belli? Is it provoking China to an extent? Another quick fire round, 30 seconds each, and we'll pick it up from there. Bradley Bowman, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
As FTD's president, Cliff Mace, said in his column today in the Washington Times, it was a diplomatic faux pas for President Biden to call Xi a dictator. But, there is this little factoid. He is a dictator, right? He's the classic definition of a dictator, an autocrat. And, under Marxist ideology, that's something to be proud of. And so, it's important to call a spade, but when you are the leader of the United States, you have to be more careful. And Biden, this is not Biden's first slip of the tongue.
Yeah, calling a spade a dictator. Dan Perry.
I mean, well before Biden was known as president or even vice president, he was known for his gaffes. So I don't think anyone is shocked, least of all she. Moreover, look, I mean, these two countries have a real rivalry in almost every way. It's pretty extreme, but I think it's also under control so long as China doesn't do anything untoward in Taiwan. I think that's more or less where we stand on the casus belli.
Carice Witte?
Yeah, I'm going to take it to Taiwan as well. That's where there could be trouble. And I think it's also a matter of the United States making sure that there's no mistakes. That will be the focus of, that is the hot spot where everyone is worried. Certainly, I think it's more concerning that there's no military-to-military communication between the U.S. and China, where both of them are deeply embedded in the Taiwan Straits, and anything could happen at any time.
Well, let's circle back to Biden's statement referring to the recent Blinken visit, this emergency visit. Was it a success, a failure? Did it achieve anything, really, Carice?
They had very low expectations, and they met them. There was a long and serious talk between the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister, Qin Gang. Blinken also had an opportunity to speak to Wang Yi. He did get a bit chewed out, but it wasn't terrible, and a meeting with Xi Jinping as well. And I think that there is an understanding by both countries that not only is it good for them to lower the temperature, but the world needs them to lower the temperature. And they will be suffering a lot of criticism globally if they don't do it. On the China side, China, I talked about the numbers game in the United Nations. That is very real for China. And when you see yourself as the head of the global South or 130 plus countries, you don't want to upset all of them by doing things that can lead to a potential global conflagration.
Yeah, Bradley Bowman.
The U.S.-China bilateral relationship, speaking of bilateral relationships, is the most influential and consequential in the world and will likely be for decades to come. And if there's a sneeze in this bilateral relationship, the world's going to catch a cold. And so it needs to be managed responsibly on both sides. I think it's clear where the primary source of tension is coming from in this relationship. It's Taiwan. And let's be clear. Let's be more specific. What about Taiwan? It's the increasingly aggressive military posturing of the People's Liberation Army in the seas and skies around Taiwan, and the refusal to take military force off the table. That is the source of tension. So if there's going to be a conflict here, it's not going to be started by the United States. It's going to be Beijing initiating aggression against the 25 million people in Taiwan who want to be free and don't want to see what happened to them, what happened in Hong Kong.
But would the basic strategic positions of both remain unchanged? Are we on the road to nowhere? Is there any scenario of de-escalation, or is it just, an inevitable course, collision course at some point, Dan Perry?
I mean, I think it largely depends on Xi, as has been said. China's saber-rattling, in a way, vis-a-vis Taiwan is what is the source of most of the tension. It's not the only thing. I mean, there's also the matter of Xi's pulling back on any notion of liberalization of China, his engineering of his third term, and movement towards a status of being pretty close to a dictator, as has been said. None of that pleases the West. All of it creates a certain sense of unpredictability about China, because as with Putin, when one man is a dictator, and it's not quite the same, but it's sort of moving that direction, you never know what he's going to do. I think China has a lot of levers to project to the world that despite all these things, it wants to be a team player on the world stage. It has a lot of areas in which it can play a positive role, beginning perhaps with Russia, Ukraine. So it's largely up to Xi. And since he is a clever fellow, I wouldn't be at all surprised to see him lower the flames, because I think it does benefit China at this particular time.
I want to add that it is not only because of China that there could be a conflict. If there is an accident, if something happens accidentally and an American dies, or something happens and, I don't know, Chinese die, it will, even though there's no attempt to take over, because of the accident, you could have a really terrible situation. That's one point I want to make. The other is that we're leaving out one of the most important factors in the China-U.S. conflict, and that is technology. And that puts Israel in the crosshairs on the one hand, but the bigger picture, technology, whoever owns the fourth industrial revolution technology is going to receive a coupon from the world. And if it is divided up among the two great powers and then maybe some other powers, it's one thing. But if it's all in the hands of one or the other, that, depending on which set of hands it's in, it could lead to a complete reshaping of global governance, and the world could look very, very different from what we're seeing today.
If Netanyahu really wants to teach...
one sec. Yeah, Bradley, please.
The emphasis on technology is so rightly stated, and let's be clear, that's the primary reason why China is interested in Israel. Israel is not a superpower, but it is a technology superpower, and that's the #1 thing that the PRC and the PLA want from China. They want from Israel. They want Israel's technology to create national champion Chinese companies and to funnel that technology to the People's Liberation Army so it can be used against American forces in the Taiwan Strait on or about 2027. So that's the primary thing China wants from Israel, and that should inform our previous discussion about the Prime Minister's visit. And I would highlight also, I agree there's danger of miscalculation here. That's why the Biden administration has been pressing for these military-to-military hotlines, if you will, which Beijing has resisted. So, I realize we want to say, hey, there's good and bad people on both sides. You want to create moral equivalency here. But, the primary conflict is going to come from Chinese aggression in the Taiwan Strait. And the United States is saying, hey, let's manage this. Let's have a range of people talking to one another to manage crises so that the little things don't become big. But they've been resistant to have that military-to-military communication, which is deeply short-sighted, I think.
Dan Perry?
Well, I was just going to say that, indeed, if Netanyahu really wants to show the Americans who's boss, then yeah, he can try to defy the various bans on selling China certain technologies that the U.S. does not want sold, up to and including defense technologies. But, one thing I think needs to be said here, because we're presenting China as potentially the aggressor, and no doubt in a way that's true on Taiwan, but the broader perspective is it is the U.S. and the West that genuinely wants to change the Chinese system. And that is a form of aggression that is perhaps at the root of part of China's defensive stance. And China, I don't think, wants to change the American system or change the system in the European Union. That's something that I think we need to remember, just as perspective and a little bit of humility as well.